So, oops, this is a bearing puller, and usually you would put that inside the bearing and this would hook over it and you'd be able to extract it. Unfortunately, this one's fairly easy to use, even though it's kind of flimsy. Unfortunately, we're going to have to go the blind bearing puller route. I'm sure of this because I can actually see damage inside the bearing and the spaces between them. What we have is one bearing and then a spacer and then the other bearing. And I'd say to remove the other, when the bearings were replaced, I'd say what they actually did was hammer them out by hooking something with a point like a screwdriver between the spacer and the bearing and just beating the daylights out of it. So this little gem here I don't pull out real often, so you guys will get the amusement of watching me remember how it goes. What I've done is I've measured the inside of the bearing, so that's 16.5 millimeters. This puller is 16.74, which is kind of close enough. So when I put that in there, it comes to size. Now these guys have a little bit of a, they're actually cut, as you can see, so when I've pushed that in, the whole lot is squeezed in. And basically we put we screw this little guy up its behind, and this will then spread the puller into the bearing. So we need a couple of spaces. Okay, so I actually switched the camera off while I got my head around this device, and I suggest you guys do the same. But basically, it is pretty much how I said before. We put our we put that spreader bolt down the middle, spread it out until it's got a grip. Then we're locking this center shaft down on top of that, so the center shaft screws into it, and then we lock it down with that. And then I'm holding this center bolt still with an Allen wrench, and I'm now simply winding it using our spanner on there, and that's basically pulled the bearing to the point where it's almost out. So the bearing is now hitting the little legs. So I suppose we can try and shift the legs out a bit. Being careful not to damage the soft alloy of the rim with the legs. See, now I've got it moving, it's actually coming out quite easily. Also, every bearing pull is different, so this one is just a guide on mine. I don't know where I got this from. I've had it for ages, but I rarely use it. If I can thump a bearing out just using a hammer, I will. I guess that's just the old school way of doing things. tension off it. Loosen the legs. We'll actually go around and we'll do the same on the other side. In fact, if we're really, really lucky, that spreader in there Now I've actually left this little device in there because I'm going to use it to drive the bearing the rest of the way out. Now I found a relatively soft bolt, but it's not long enough. So I tried a soft bolt, but it wasn't long enough. So I've gone with an old screwdriver. Bearing in mind we're not reusing this bearing. And there we go. So what fell out? Good question. Our bearing fell out and the spacer I've been talking about. And the spacer does have some damage in it. But that's okay, because we've got it under control. Now, because we don't have the spacer in there anymore, we can actually get our screwdriver behind the bearing. But what we would like to do is push the bearing out fairly squarely. Nice. I'm just using old screwdrivers here, obviously. Ones that have been used for prying and whatnot. You need to make sure is that you're only hitting the bearing and nothing else. Yep. Ooh, bit of a spark there even. Now, sometimes might wonder if we're having an effect. So it's good just to measure and see what you can see. So I'm getting the impression that we might have to use the bearing puller again. But we'll hit it a few more times just in case. We'll even upgrade hammers. Oh, and that did the trick. Oh, there's our bearing. That's nice. That's a good bearing. So these bearings were taken out with the intention of replacing them. We've got some nice new ones. Go. Now, you can make a size comparison because we want to check to make sure they're the right size simply by putting one on top of the other. And you can see that the centre there is the same size. And it's amazing how accurate the human being as a measuring instrument can be, because you would be able to feel a difference in size between those two just doing that. And of course we've got the thickness issue as well. And we double check, if we're slightly more technically minded, by using our vernier caliper. So there we have 40.05, we have 40.02, we have a width of 11.97 and 11.98, and internal 16.93 and 16.87. So these guys look really good to me. So I'm gonna make these old bearings disappear, because I don't want to make the mistake of accidentally putting an old bearing back in. So we'll put these in the packet that the new ones came in, but not in the plastic, because that's how I tell if something's new or not. If it comes in plastic, it's new. So we were talking about the spacer, and we saw that when it dropped out. This is our spacer. These are our two bearings. So you can sort of picture that sitting like that. And the idea being simply to make sure that these bearings, when the wheel nut is tightened, don't cut away, so to speak. Don't wear the alloy of the rim out to the point where the wheel loosens off, because that's a tragedy waiting to happen. So that basically makes sure that when you tighten up the axle, that spacer there is not compressible, unlike the soft alloy of the rim that the bearings sit in. So you can imagine without that there, instead of the pressure going through the spacer, it would be transmitted to the soft wheel instead. So not necessarily good. So I've also cleaned up the previous damage from the inside of this. Ooh. And you need to make sure that the spacer passes, and it does. And the bearings themselves, oh, nice. Okay, so a good sliding fit. There's absolutely no movement there, and that's what we want, because these are the bearings, of course, that our wheel runs on. So I'm actually about to have a break, and the reason for that is that I'm going to make this job just a little bit easier by putting these guys in the freezer for a while. How long depends on you. I mean, you can drive them in at lukewarm. it's not a problem, and they will go in with a bit of work. But I find that if you drop them in the freezer, they will go in easier, because when they go in the freezer they contract, so they become fractionally smaller. And these bearings are what we call an interference fit, a very light interference fit. And they have to be that way so that the bearing doesn't spin within the soft metal of the wheel, that the bearing instead holds onto the side of the wheel, because it's a very similar size to it, and the axle spins on the bearing itself, which is what we want. So I'm going to make our lives easier and put those in the freezer. Alright, so the bearings have been in the freezer for a while. As I say, a couple of hours will do it. Even a couple of minutes will make a difference. And what I'm doing now, I'm just cleaning up where the bearing goes with some methylated spirits and a rag. Now if there's any damage in there, any deep scratches or ridges, you probably should clean them up very carefully with some wet and dry sandpaper. If they're really bad, use a file, but I don't recommend using a file. So we'll just flip this guy over. Our delicate vernier calipers out of harm's way. I can tell by the rust inside this rim that somebody has been hitting it with a pressure washer. It's good to clean your bike, don't get me wrong, but you need to keep high pressure water and degreasers away from moving parts like bearings. They really are bad for them. Now, some people would disagree with this. This is just me. Well, actually, it's not an uncommon practice. What I'm doing is just putting a light smear of grease into where the bearing goes. That's going to achieve two things. It's going to make the bearing go in easier, and hopefully I have this bike long enough and get enough pleasure out of it to have to replace these bearings again, in which case it's going to come out a lot easier when I put the replacement in there. And the final thing I'm going to do while the bearings are cooling off, I've selected a socket, and this is what we're going to drive the new bearings in with. And I'm making sure that it's not going to get stuck. It has the possibility of it, but because we've got a large flat, we'll be able to put something in there to drive it back out again. Just need to see how self-centering the spacer is as well. Reasonably. We'll need to keep an eye on that. So I reckon I should go into the fridge and get some bearings. Now, when we drive these bearings in, we don't want to put pressure on the centre of the bearing. This is one of the old bearings, by the way. The new bearings are actually very close by, but I don't want to touch them because the heat from my hands will warm them up. We don't want that. So ideally we would drive the bearings in squarely, and that's the way I've chosen to do it. And I've actually picked a socket that's probably just, if it was a millimetre smaller in diameter I'd be happy, but I don't have a 29mm socket, so I'm using a 30. So we don't want to drive the bearing in from the centre, because you've got little balls there on the outside that join the outer bearing to the inner, and it will damage them, and you don't want that. You want nice, smooth, fresh bearings. So I like to drive them in square from both centre and outside. If you have a choice, definitely do the outside. If you've got the only option is one or the other, definitely the outside. The thing is that when you drive it in like that, it's not going to make any real difference. You're not putting the centre pressure on the centre and damaging the bearings inside. When you drive on the outside, of course, then there's no pressure on the ball bearings at all. Now, when you put the bearings in, we'll do one side at a time. You need to make sure they go in square, and by that I mean that they're not in the hole at an angle. You want it to be as straight up and, as clean and straight as possible. There we go. Nice. And it's sitting there nicely. So that's one. And we'll put that there. And flip her over. Don't forget the spacer. Right, and the spacer does centralise fairly well. Okay, once again, and what I'm doing is, as I'm creeping up on the alignment of that spacer, I'm checking to make sure it's central, because that is critical. Right. Okay. Nice. Very nice. Very nice indeed. Okay, now we have one more bearing to do. Now I'm just trying to work out the best course of events for this, because that is a bearing just like the others. However, it has a bush on the inside and it's pressed into the carrier for the sprocket. So this is a bit of a double whammy. We have to drive it out on two sides, and we have to be very careful because it's alloy. So this is our new bearing. This is the one that I said was actually in really good condition. It is. So I'd say at some point somebody has had to give it the business. So I don't know the best way to attack this. Depending on how hard it's pressed together, how hard it's put together, it could fall apart fairly easily. So it's worth attempting to drive that centre out first, and then flipping her over, and then driving the bearing out. So we seem to have the right bearing. So you can see what I mean there though, like we've got, that's our bearing, and we have extra bits. So let's just see what we come up with. Okie dokie. So once again we seem to be using our socket set more as a set of drifts. Wow, that was easy, wasn't it? So that's that bush we were just talking about on the inside. Yep, that'll do. Once again, bearing in mind that we're not actually going to keep this bearing. We are going to keep the cush drives though, so we do need to be careful. Wow, this is coming apart like too easy. There we go. So you can actually see trapped water in there. Interesting. Nice and clean. Let's find a socket to drive it in with. Okay. Now, there's our new bearing and our old bearing, and the comparison is good. So oops, bit of a clean up. Okay. Now, one thing you might have noticed is that we don't actually have to measure the position of these bearings, because their positions are located by shoulders and things like that. So for example, when we drive this guy into the center here, it's going to stop at the right place. because it can't go past that shoulder. And the same when we drive it into the centre of the carrier. So all we need to do is just make sure that it goes until it stops. And you'll actually hear it when you hit it, and you will feel it. It will become harder. Because every time you hit it, it seems like I'm hitting these hard. I'm not, for a start. And every time you hit it and it's hit the shoulder or bottomed out, it becomes a lot firmer and the sound changes. That's the best way I can describe it. It's a thing of practice, really. Somebody's just said to me that there are things out there called bearing presses. That's correct. But you've got to remember what I'm about is showing you guys how to do stuff with what you've got. So we had to use a bearing puller today. We had no choice because it's a blind bearing. So that's probably one of the few occasions where we use a special tool. Think about that. And, well, that really wants to go on there, doesn't it? I salute its enthusiasm. Oh, that's a good idea. There we go. Now let's get that out of there. And grease, once again. So the way that came out, by the way, that just implies to me it's been out recently in the bike's running history, which is different to, time, chronological history, because this bike has been dormant for a long time. I think the last time it was registered, definitely pre-COVID, probably around 2016 or something like that. Okay, so easy as that. And nice. Very nice. Ooh. But it was just as nice before. There's nothing wrong with the bearing we took out. Which leads to the next thing. Although it's normal for me to look at things like wheel bearings and brake pads, in your own bike, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. By all means, investigate these things, check them. Definitely it's a good idea to check things. But if you find that once you've checked them they're quite satisfactory, definitely don't do the job for the sake of doing the job. That's just a waste of your time and money. Right, so we should probably finish off by putting some dust seals in. So, find out what I did with my grease. And these are dust seals, so it's sort of, if you start putting grease all over them willy-nilly, it's sort of going to be, it's going to be contrary to actually what the thing is designed to do. Now, like the bearing, they just need to go in square. And generally, they don't need much persuasion. So you can see I'm pushing this guy in by hand. And that's worked just fine. People will be amazed to know that I have more than 3 hammers in my collection. Yep. And of course our other seal. Just put him there for a second. Once again, a smear of our grease. These are the original seals. If your seals aren't as good as mine, definitely source replacements. They're still out there, you can still get them. Once again, nice. That's that. That's our new wheel bearings.